Billionaire calls his wife a maid at the business gala, then freezes when his boss names her the host. Hello everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our new videos. It's quick, it's free, and it's the best way to help us bring you more dramatic, unforgettable stories. Your support truly means the world. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much, and now, let's jump back into the story. The moment Daniel Whitmore introduced his wife as the help, something inside Claire died that she didn't know could still feel pain. The grand imperial ballroom sparkled with the kind of wealth that made even millionaires feel poor. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured rainbows across marble floors so polished they reflected the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos of Chicago's elite. Claire Whitmore stood at the edge of the reception area, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the modest black dress Daniel had insisted she wear tonight. Not her emerald gown hanging in their closet. Not the pearl necklace his mother had given her on their wedding day. This plain, almost servant-like dress that made her invisible among the peacocks. She'd married Daniel 6 years ago when he was climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian Industries, back when he still looked at her like she hung the moon. Back when he'd trace her cheekbone with his thumb and whisper that she was the only real thing in his manufactured world. Claire had been a social worker then, pulling double shifts at the community center, her hands rough from organizing donation drives and her heart full of purpose. Daniel said he loved that about her, her authenticity, her groundedness, the way she made him feel human. But somewhere between his first million and his first billion, something shifted. The man who once brought her coffee in bed started scheduling their conversations through his assistant. The husband who'd slow danced with her in their tiny apartment kitchen now flinched when she reached for his hand in public. Shame crept into his eyes whenever his business partners asked about her background, about her family who still lived in a working-class neighborhood on the South Side. Tonight was supposed to be his crowning achievement. Meridian Industries' annual gala brought together every major player in commercial real estate development, the industry that had transformed Daniel from ambitious executive to billionaire mogul. He'd barely spoken to her during the car ride here, his jaw tight, his instructions clipped. Stay quiet. Don't mention your old job. If anyone asks, you're helping coordinate the staff tonight. Claire had swallowed the humiliation like bitter medicine. She'd learned to do that over the past 3 years, ever since Daniel started pretending she didn't exist in professional settings. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that once he felt more secure in his position, he'd stop hiding her. But the lies compounded. At investor dinners, she became a family friend. At charity auctions, she was just passing through. And now, at the most important event of his career, she was the help. She watched him across the ballroom now, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he laughed at something Harrison said. Harrison was a senior partner, the kind of man whose approval could make or break careers. Daniel's whole body angled toward him with calculated deference, his smile bright and empty as a showroom. He hadn't looked at Claire once since they'd arrived 30 minutes ago. Champagne, miss? A young waiter appeared at her elbow, balancing a tray of crystal flutes. Claire took one with a murmured thanks, though she had no intention of drinking it. Her stomach churned with a familiar cocktail of anger and resignation. How many times had she enabled this? How many times had she smiled through his dismissals, rationalized his coldness, convinced herself that love meant sacrifice? Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a man who's ashamed of you in public won't honor you in private. But Claire had been so sure Daniel was different. She'd been so certain that the boy who'd proposed to her on a rooftop under string lights, his hands shaking and his voice thick with emotion, was still in there somewhere. The ballroom doors opened, and a ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Victoria Rothschild had arrived, the legendary CEO of Rothschild Holdings, Meridian's largest client, and the woman whose opinion could reshape entire markets. She moved through the room like gravity itself had shifted to accommodate her, her silver hair swept into an elegant twist, her burgundy gown a statement of power that didn't need to announce itself. Claire recognized her immediately. She'd seen Victoria's face in Forbes, in Wall Street Journal profiles, in the business magazines that cluttered Daniel's home office. But she'd never mentioned to Daniel that she knew Victoria personally, that their connection ran deeper than corporate contracts and profit margins. Because some secrets were worth keeping, even from the man who'd stopped keeping you. Daniel was already moving toward Victoria, his expression carefully arranged into confident humility. Claire watched him navigate the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging handshakes and air kisses, his laughter ringing out at precisely calibrated intervals. He'd become so good at performing, at being the version of himself that other people wanted to see. She wondered if he even remembered who he'd been before the money, before the pressure, before shame became his compass. As Daniel reached Victoria's inner circle, his eyes finally found Claire across the room. For just a second, something flickered in his face. Was it regret? Recognition? But then Harrison Chen appeared at his shoulder, and Daniel's expression hardened into something cold and decisive. Claire's throat tightened as she watched her husband lean toward Harrison, his lips moving in what looked like an introduction. Harrison's gaze followed Daniel's gesture, landing on Claire with mild curiosity. And then Daniel said something that made Harrison's eyebrows rise slightly, and a polite, dismissive smile cross his features. The crowd began to shift, flowing toward the main ballroom where dinner would be served. Claire stood frozen as the reality settled over her like a heavy fog. Daniel had done it. He'd actually introduced her as staff. The betrayal wasn't surprising anymore, that was the worst part. She'd expected it, braced for it, and still it carved another piece away from who she used to be. But as the crowd moved past her, treating her with the polite invisibility reserved for service workers, Claire made a decision. She'd played along with Daniel's shame for 3 years, shrinking herself to fit inside his comfort zone, but tonight something inside her had finally broken through the numbness. Tonight, she would let him discover exactly what he'd thrown away. Tonight, the truth would find its moment, and when it did, the man who'd called her the help would learn that dignity couldn't be hidden by a modest black dress or a husband's cowardice. Because Victoria Rothschild hadn't just arrived as Meridian's most important client. She'd arrived as the woman who'd chosen Claire for something Daniel couldn't even imagine. And in less than an hour, when Victoria took that stage to make her announcement, Daniel's entire carefully constructed world would shatter like the crystal chandeliers above their heads, and Claire would finally stop shrinking herself to accommodate a man who'd forgotten how to see her. The dinner bells chimed, and the crowd began to move. Claire took a breath and followed, her heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Daniel's hand was cold and impersonal on her elbow as he steered Claire toward a cluster of senior executives, his grip tight enough to leave marks she'd find tomorrow. "This is Claire," Daniel said, his voice carrying that smooth, dismissive tone he reserved for people he considered beneath notice. "She's been helping coordinate the service staff tonight. Making sure everything runs smoothly behind the scenes." Claire felt the words land like physical blows. Behind the scenes. Where she belonged, according to the man who'd once promised her the world. Harrison Chen's wife, Melissa, gave Claire a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile wealthy people reserved for those who served them. "How lovely. The staff has done an exceptional job. You must tell us your secret for keeping everyone so organized." The assumption hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They thought she was an event coordinator Daniel had hired. Not his wife of 6 years. Not the woman who'd held him through panic attacks when his first major deal nearly collapsed. Not the person who still left encouraging notes in his briefcase even though he'd stopped reading them years ago. "It's really about attention to detail," Claire heard herself say, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook. She'd become so good at swallowing humiliation that it went down almost smooth now. Daniel's jaw relaxed slightly. He'd been nervous about how she'd respond, she realized. Some small, petty part of him had worried she might cause a scene, might claim her actual position in his life and expose his carefully constructed lie. The fact that he looked relieved when she played along made something inside Claire's chest crack further. "Well, excellent work," Harrison said, already losing interest. His attention shifted back to Daniel. "Now, about that Portland acquisition. Victoria's very interested in your approach. She specifically requested you present the development timeline tonight." Pride flickered across Daniel's face, bright and hungry. This was what he lived for now, the approval of men like Harrison, the validation that came from being seen as a major player. Claire remembered when his ambition had been balanced by compassion, when success meant creating affordable housing projects alongside luxury developments. He'd talked about building communities, about using wealth as a tool for positive change. But billion-dollar real estate deals didn't leave much room for idealism. The man standing beside her now specialized in luxury high-rises that displaced working families, in commercial centers that bulldozed historical neighborhoods. He'd become the very thing he once despised, and worse, he'd convinced himself it was necessary, inevitable, the price of playing in the big leagues. "Claire, why don't you check on the kitchen?" Daniel said, his tone suggesting it wasn't really a suggestion. "Make sure the timing's right for dinner service." It was a dismissal. A clear signal that her presence was no longer useful or desired. Melissa Chen had already turned away, her attention captured by someone more important. Harrison was pulling Daniel deeper into the conversation, their voices dropping to the conspiratorial tone of men discussing seven-figure deals. Claire stood there for a moment, invisible in plain sight, and felt the full weight of what her marriage had become. This wasn't love. It hadn't been love for a long time. This was a transaction she'd somehow agreed to, where she traded her dignity for the illusion of partnership, where she shrank herself smaller and smaller until she might as well not exist at all. "Excuse me," she murmured, though no one was listening. She moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned to take up no space. Other guests parted around her automatically, their eyes sliding past her modest dress, their conversations continuing uninterrupted. To them, she was part of the backdrop, necessary for the evening's success but unworthy of acknowledgement. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. These people had no idea that half the charitable foundations represented in this room had been funded by Claire's strategic planning. That the community outreach programs Meridian Industries claimed as proof of their corporate responsibility had been her initiatives, presented to the board under Daniel's name because he'd convinced her it would be better received that way. That she'd spent 6 years building her husband's reputation while he systematically erased hers. Claire found herself near the stage area, where final sound checks were being completed. The massive screens flanking the podium displayed the Meridian Industries logo, all clean lines and corporate confidence. Soon Daniel would stand up there and deliver his presentation, basking in applause and admiration, and she would watch from the shadows like she always did. Except tonight was different. Tonight, Claire knew something Daniel didn't. She caught sight of Victoria Rothschild near the main entrance, speaking quietly with a young woman holding an iPad, probably her assistant, coordinating the evening's program. Victoria's eyes found Claire's across the room, and something passed between them. A moment of recognition. Of acknowledgement. Victoria's subtle nod was almost imperceptible, but it sent a current of electricity through Claire's exhausted body. This was really happening. After months of secret meetings, careful planning, and soul-searching conversations that lasted past midnight, this was the moment everything would change. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please find your seats," the event coordinator's voice rang through the ballroom. "Dinner will be served shortly, and we have a very special program planned for this evening." Claire watched Daniel move toward the head table, Harrison Chen at his side, both men radiating the easy confidence of people who'd never questioned their place in the world. Daniel's eyes swept the room but never landed on her. She'd become so invisible to him that even in a room of hundreds, he couldn't find her. Or maybe he just wasn't looking. The guests settled into their seats, the excited chatter building as waiters began delivering the first course. Claire remained standing near the stage, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought about the girl she'd been 6 years ago, so full of hope and conviction, so certain that love could survive anything. She thought about the compromises she'd made, the pieces of herself she'd surrendered, the slow erosion of her spirit in service of a man who'd stopped seeing her as human. But mostly she thought about what was coming, and how Daniel's face would look when he realized that the woman he'd tried to erase was about to become the center of everyone's attention. Victoria was approaching the stage now, her presence commanding immediate attention. The room fell quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Daniel leaned forward in his seat, his expression eager and alert. He probably thought this was about his Portland project, about Victoria publicly endorsing his vision. He had no idea that the real announcement had nothing to do with him at all. Victoria Rothschild's heels clicked against the stage floor like a countdown to detonation, each step measured and deliberate, each movement radiating the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. Claire's breath caught in her chest as Victoria took the microphone, her burgundy gown catching the spotlight in a way that seemed almost symbolic. The entire ballroom had fallen silent, the kind of reverent quiet that descended when someone truly important prepared to speak. Claire could see Daniel at the head table, sitting straighter, adjusting his tie with one hand while the other rested confidently on the white tablecloth. He thought this moment was for him. They all did. "Good evening, everyone," Victoria began, her voice smooth and commanding. "Thank you for joining us at what has become the premier gathering of Chicago's business community. Tonight, we're not just here to celebrate another successful year. We're here to honor something much more meaningful: vision, integrity, and the kind of leadership that transforms communities rather than simply profiting from them." Claire felt her pulse thrumming in her ears. She'd heard this speech before, in Victoria's office 3 weeks ago, when they'd rehearsed every word and anticipated every reaction. But hearing it now, with Daniel sitting 20 feet away completely unaware of what was coming, made it feel surreal and terrifying and necessary all at once. Meridian Industries has long been a valued partner of Rothschild Holdings, Victoria continued, and Claire saw Daniel's chest puff slightly with pride. But our most exciting collaboration isn't with Meridian's development team. It's with someone whose work has been quietly revolutionizing how we think about corporate social responsibility, community investment, and sustainable urban development. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel's confident expression flickered slightly, confusion creasing his forehead. Harrison Chen leaned toward him, whispering something Claire couldn't hear, but Daniel shook his head. He didn't know. He genuinely had no idea what was about to happen. "For the past 18 months, Victoria said, her eyes now scanning the crowd until they landed directly on Claire, I've had the privilege of working with a remarkable strategist who approached me with a revolutionary concept. What if luxury development and community empowerment weren't opposing forces? What if we could create high-end properties that actually strengthened rather than displaced existing neighborhoods?" Claire's hands were shaking now. Several people in the crowd had followed Victoria's gaze and were looking at her with curious expressions. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes beginning to register her presence, to pull her out of the invisible background she'd occupied all evening. "This visionary didn't just present me with abstract theories," Victoria continued, her voice gaining intensity. "She showed me detailed plans for mixed-income housing developments. She demonstrated how luxury amenities could be designed to include and benefit long-term residents. She proved, with data and passion and an unshakable commitment to both profit and purpose, that we could do better than the extractive development model that's dominated our industry for decades." Daniel's face had gone pale. Claire watched him trying to process what he was hearing, watched the pieces clicking into place with agonizing slowness. His eyes found her across the room, and for the first time in 3 years, she saw him truly see her. Not the diminished, quiet woman he'd trained to stay in the background. Not the convenient wife he could hide when it served him. But Claire, the person she'd been before he'd started chipping away at her, the woman with ideas and passion and the courage to act on her convictions. The Rothschild Holdings Community Development Initiative represents a $5 billion commitment over the next 10 years, Victoria announced, and gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. $5 billion dedicated to proving that conscious capitalism isn't just a buzzword. And I'm thrilled to announce that heading this initiative, serving as Chief Director of Sustainable Development, is the brilliant mind who conceived it, Claire Whitmore. The room exploded into applause, but Claire barely heard it. All she could see was Daniel's face, frozen in an expression somewhere between shock and horror. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hand gripped the edge of the table like he needed something solid to hold on to. Beside him, Harrison Chen's head swiveled between Daniel and the stage, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine surprise. "Claire, would you please join me?" Victoria extended her hand toward the stage, and suddenly Claire's legs were moving, carrying her forward through a crowd that parted with entirely different energy than before. They weren't making way for the help anymore. They were making way for someone who apparently mattered, someone who'd just been announced as directing a $5 billion initiative, someone who couldn't be ignored or dismissed or relegated to the background. Claire climbed the stage steps on trembling legs, her modest black dress suddenly feeling like armor rather than camouflage. Victoria's hand closed around hers, warm and steady and real. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria said, and the room quieted again instantly. "I want to tell you how this partnership began. 18 months ago, I received a detailed proposal from Claire Whitmore, a woman I'd never heard of, with no formal training in real estate development, but with 15 years of experience in social work and community organizing. She walked into my office with 300 pages of research, neighborhood testimonials, economic projections, and a vision so compelling I cleared my entire afternoon to listen." Claire's throat tightened. She remembered that day with crystal clarity, the terror of reaching out to one of the most powerful women in real estate, the certainty that she'd be dismissed as naive or unqualified, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen to what she'd been trying to tell Daniel for years. "What impressed me most," Victoria continued, her hand still gripping Claire's, "wasn't just her brilliant strategy. It was her integrity. When I asked why she wasn't presenting this through her husband's company, given his position at Meridian Industries, she said something I'll never forget." Victoria turned to face Claire directly. She said, "This work is too important to be filtered through someone who's forgotten why communities matter. I need a partner who still believes buildings should serve people, not the other way around." The room was so quiet Claire could hear her own heartbeat. She glanced toward Daniel's table and saw him sitting perfectly still, his face drained of color, his eyes locked on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Betrayal? Or was it something else, the dawning realization of exactly what he'd lost while he'd been busy hiding her away? Victoria released Claire's hand and addressed the crowd again. "Claire Whitmore is brilliant, principled, and committed to changing our industry for the better. I'm honored to work with her, and I'm excited for you all to see what she accomplishes. The future of urban development isn't about choosing between profit and purpose. It's about having the courage to demand both. Claire has that courage, and I have no doubt she'll inspire all of us to raise our standards." The applause was deafening now. Claire stood under the spotlight, her modest dress no longer making her invisible but instead highlighting the contrast between who she actually was and who Daniel had tried to make her. She could see people at tables throughout the ballroom pulling out phones, typing rapidly, probably looking her up, trying to understand who this woman was that Victoria Rothschild was championing so publicly. And at the head table, Daniel sat frozen, still gripping the white tablecloth, still staring at the wife he'd introduced as the help less than an hour ago. The wife who'd apparently been building an empire while he'd been busy being ashamed of her. The wife who'd outgrown him so completely that she'd found a new partner, a better partner, who actually valued what she brought to the table. Claire took the microphone from Victoria, her hands steadier now, and looked out at the sea of faces turned toward her with sudden respect and attention. Somewhere in that crowd, her husband was learning that the woman he'd tried to diminish was about to become one of the most influential voices in their industry. And the night was just beginning. The microphone felt heavier than Claire expected, solid and real in a way that made her hyper-aware of every breath, every tremor in her hands, every single person staring at her with expressions that ranged from fascination to confusion to, in Daniel's case, something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Thank you, Victoria," Claire heard herself say, and her voice was stronger than she'd anticipated. "And thank you all for your attention, though I suspect some of you are wondering who I am and why you should care about anything I have to say." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Claire's eyes swept across the ballroom, deliberately skipping over Daniel's table. She couldn't look at him yet. Not while she was trying to hold herself together, not while she was standing in front of Chicago's business elite about to reveal truths she'd kept buried for too long. "I've spent the last 15 years working in community development and social services," Claire continued. "I've watched neighborhoods I love get bulldozed for luxury condos that sit empty half the year. I've consoled families forced from homes they'd lived in for generations because property values suddenly made them inconvenient. I've seen the human cost of development that prioritizes profit margins over people's lives." The energy in the room shifted. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the typical corporate platitudes they'd expected, this was challenge, direct and uncompromising. "But here's what I've also learned," Claire said, warming to her message now. "Caring about communities doesn't mean abandoning sound business practices. Creating sustainable, mixed-income developments isn't charity, it's smart economics. When you invest in neighborhoods rather than displacing them, you build customer loyalty that lasts generations. When you design spaces that serve diverse populations, you create resilient markets that weather economic downturns. When you treat people with dignity instead of viewing them as obstacles to profit, you build something that actually lasts." She paused, letting the words settle. Victoria stood beside her, nodding almost imperceptibly, her presence a steady reminder that Claire wasn't alone in this. "The Rothschild Holdings Community Development Initiative isn't about feel-good gestures or corporate image rehabilitation," Claire continued. "It's about proving that conscious development can outperform extractive models. We're going to build beautiful, profitable properties that strengthen rather than destroy the communities they're part of. We're going to demonstrate that including long-term residents in development planning creates better outcomes for everyone. We're going to show this industry that there's another way forward." The applause that followed was more thoughtful than enthusiastic. Claire had challenged them, made them think, and not everyone appreciated being pushed outside their comfort zone. But she saw several people nodding, leaning forward with genuine interest. She saw Victoria's smile of approval. And she saw Harrison Chen lean toward Daniel and whisper something that made her husband's jaw clench visibly. "I know many of you are skeptical," Claire said, reclaiming the room's attention. "You've been told that social responsibility and maximum profit can't coexist. You've been taught that successful development requires a certain ruthlessness, a willingness to view communities as commodities. I'm here to tell you that's not just wrong, it's lazy thinking that limits our potential." Now she let her eyes find Daniel's table. Her husband sat rigid, his face a mask of controlled emotions, but his hands were gripping his water glass so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Harrison Chen looked between them with sharp, calculating interest, clearly reassessing everything he thought he knew about Daniel Whitmore and his mysteriously connected wife. "Some of you might be wondering how I ended up partnering with Victoria Rothschild instead of working through more traditional channels," Claire said, her voice dropping to a more intimate register. "The truth is, I tried traditional channels first. I presented these ideas to someone very close to me, someone in a position to champion them, someone I trusted to see their potential." Daniel's face went ashen. Around the room, people leaned forward, sensing personal drama beneath the professional presentation. "But I was told my ideas were naive," Claire continued, each word carefully chosen, each syllable landing like a small detonation. "I was told that real development requires hard choices and that my background in social work had made me too sentimental. I was told to focus on supporting his career rather than pursuing my own ambitions. I was told, essentially, that caring about people was incompatible with serious business success." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Claire could feel Victoria's supportive presence beside her, could see several women in the audience nodding with recognition, could sense the shift in energy as people began connecting dots they hadn't noticed before. "So I went around those traditional channels," Claire said simply. "I took my 300 pages of research and walked into Victoria Rothschild's office as a complete unknown. I risked rejection and humiliation because I believed in this vision more than I believed in playing it safe. And Victoria gave me what the traditional channels couldn't. She gave me a chance to prove myself based on the merit of my ideas rather than the limitations of other people's imagination." More applause now, stronger and more genuine. Claire saw several people at Daniel's table exchanging glances, saw Melissa Chen's expression shift from polite boredom to sharp reassessment. The woman they dismissed as hired help an hour ago was revealing herself to be something entirely different, someone with power and vision and the courage to claim her own space. "I'm grateful to Victoria for taking that chance," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion she didn't try to hide. "But I'm also grateful for the rejection that led me to her door. Sometimes being told no by the wrong people is exactly what you need to find the right ones. Sometimes having your worth dismissed by someone who should have seen it is the catalyst that forces you to prove it to yourself instead." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. All eyes turned toward him, the sudden movement impossible to ignore. For a moment, Claire thought he might leave, might storm out in humiliation or anger. But he just stood there, frozen, his face a landscape of warring emotions, shock, shame, recognition, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding exactly what he'd done. "I'll be sharing more details about the Community Development Initiative in the coming weeks," Claire said, pulling attention back to the stage. "For now, I just want to say this, to everyone in this room who's ever been told your ideas weren't practical enough, or you weren't experienced enough, or you cared too much about the wrong things, don't believe them. Find your Victoria Rothschild. Find the people who see your value and want to build something meaningful together. And to those of you who've been doing the dismissing, pay attention to who you're underestimating. You might be surprised what they accomplish when they stop waiting for your approval." The applause that erupted then was thunderous, a standing ovation that rippled through the ballroom like a wave. Claire stood in the spotlight, her modest black dress suddenly transformed into something powerful, and let herself feel the validation she'd been denied for so long. Victoria squeezed her shoulder, pride radiating from her like warmth. And Daniel remained standing at his table, surrounded by colleagues who were now looking at him with entirely different eyes, beginning to understand that the woman he'd hidden was worth infinitely more than the man who'd tried to diminish her. But the real reckoning was still coming, because the night was far from over, and Claire had more to say, specifically to the husband who'd forgotten she was someone worth listening to. Claire descended the stage steps with Victoria beside her, and the crowd surged forward like she'd become magnetic, everyone suddenly desperate to shake her hand, exchange cards, position themselves in her orbit now that Victoria Rothschild had declared her valuable. The transformation was dizzying. 30 minutes ago, these same people had looked through her like she was furniture. Now they jostled for her attention, their smiles bright and hungry, their compliments flowing with the ease of people who'd always recognized her brilliance, or at least, that's what their expression suggested. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it didn't perfectly illustrate everything wrong with Daniel's world. "Ms. Whitmore, I'd love to discuss how this initiative might align with our community foundations," a woman in diamond said, pressing her card into Claire's hand. "Brilliant presentation. My firm specializes in sustainable architecture. I think we could offer significant value," a silver-haired man interjected, already pulling out his phone. Claire accepted their attention with gracious professionalism, but her eyes kept tracking toward the head table where Daniel stood apart from the crowd, his face still pale, his body language radiating something between shock and fury. Harrison Chen had appeared at his elbow, speaking quietly but urgently, and even from across the room Claire could read Daniel's tense posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Claire, a moment?" Victoria's voice cut through the noise, gentle but firm. She guided Claire away from the crowd toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, her hand protective on Claire's elbow. "Are you all right?" That took courage. "I'm shaking," Claire admitted, her voice low. But I'm okay. I needed to do that. I needed to stop hiding. Victoria's expression softened. He's coming over here, by the way. Your husband. He looks like a man whose entire world just shifted on its axis. Claire turned and saw Daniel cutting through the crowd with determined strides, his jaw set, his eyes locked on her with frightening intensity. For a moment, old instincts kicked in, the urge to smooth things over, to make herself smaller, to apologize for taking up too much space. But she forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without flinching, to claim her right to exist fully in her own life. Claire. Daniel's voice was tight, controlled, but she could hear the tremor beneath it. We need to talk. Now. I'm in the middle of a professional event, Claire said evenly. Perhaps this can wait. Perhaps? Daniel's control slipped slightly. You just announced a $5 billion initiative to an entire ballroom of my colleagues without telling me. You've apparently been working with Victoria Rothschild behind my back for 18 months. You stood on that stage and, he stopped abruptly, glancing at Victoria, remembering they weren't alone. Behind your back? Claire repeated, and something sharp entered her tone. Is that how you're framing this? Not with courage or with initiative or because she had an idea worth pursuing. Behind your back. Like I was being sneaky instead of building something meaningful. You made me look like a fool, Daniel hissed, stepping closer. Do you have any idea what Harrison Chen just said to me? He asked why my own wife didn't trust me with her ideas. He asked what kind of man doesn't know his wife is launching a major business initiative. He's questioning my judgment, my awareness, your ego? Claire finished, her voice dangerously quiet. This isn't about you, Daniel. It stopped being about you the moment you introduced me as the help and decided my worth was measured by how invisible I could make myself. Daniel's face flushed. That's not fair. You know how important tonight was for me. You know I needed to project a certain image. An image that didn't include your wife, Claire interrupted. An image where I was either invisible or serving champagne. Tell me, Daniel, when did you stop seeing me as a partner and start seeing me as an inconvenience to manage? Victoria cleared her throat delicately. I should give you two some privacy. But as she moved away, she caught Claire's eye and gave a subtle nod of support that made Claire's throat tighten with gratitude. The moment Victoria left, Daniel's composure cracked further. You had no right to go around me like this. Those ideas, some of them came from conversations we had, from concepts I mentioned. Concepts you mentioned? Claire's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. Daniel, I've been pitching community-focused development to you for 6 years. 6 years of hearing how naive I was, how I didn't understand real business, how my social work background made me too emotional to think strategically. You didn't mention concepts, you dismissed mine so thoroughly I stopped trying to share them with you. That's not how I remember it, Daniel said, but his voice had lost certainty. Of course it's not, Claire said wearily. You remember a version where you were supportive and I was unreasonable. You remember a marriage where you were the ambitious one and I was just there. Background noise. The woman you loved when she made you feel good about yourself but embarrassed you once you started running with people like Harrison Chen. I never, Daniel started, but stopped. His mouth opened and closed, searching for a defense that wouldn't come. You introduced me as the help tonight, Claire said softly. To your colleagues. To people I've met before at your company events, people who knew I was your wife. You looked them in the eye and told them I was coordinating the service staff. You erased me completely because acknowledging our marriage might make you look, what? Less impressive? Less self-made? Less worthy of their respect? Daniel's hands flexed at his sides. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The expectations, the competition, the constant need to hide anything that doesn't fit your corporate image. Claire finished. I understand perfectly, Daniel. I've understood for 3 years while I watched you slowly disappear into this person I don't recognize. The man I married cared about building communities. He talked about using wealth to create positive change. He saw people as human beings instead of obstacles to profit margins. I grew up, Daniel said harshly. I stopped being naive about how the world actually works. You can't change systems from outside them, Claire. You have to get inside first, build credibility, amass enough power that people have to listen. And in the process, become exactly like the people you said you wanted to change? Claire shook her head. You didn't grow up, Daniel. You gave up. You decided it was easier to adapt than to fight, easier to hide your wife than to defend her, easier to chase billion-dollar deals than to remember why you got into this industry in the first place. This is who I have to be to survive at this level, Daniel said, and for the first time, Claire heard something that sounded almost like desperation. You don't know what it's like, competing with people who've had wealth for generations, trying to prove I belong in rooms where everyone else had prep school and country clubs. I had to work twice as hard, be twice as sharp, present twice as well. So you made me pay the price for your insecurity, Claire said quietly. You needed to fit in, so I had to disappear. You needed to impress people, so I had to diminish myself. You needed to feel successful, so I had to become invisible. Daniel stared at her, and something in his expression shifted, recognition, maybe, or the beginning of real understanding. Claire. I loved you, she said, and her voice broke slightly. I loved you so much I convinced myself that your shame was temporary, that once you felt secure you'd remember I existed. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, that supporting your dreams meant giving up mine. But tonight, standing on that stage, I realized something. Love isn't supposed to make you smaller. Partnership isn't supposed to require one person to disappear so the other can shine. I never asked you to disappear, Daniel protested weakly. You didn't have to ask, Claire said. You just made it clear, over and over, that who I was and where I came from embarrassed you. That my compassion was weakness, my ideas were impractical, my presence was liability. You taught me to erase myself so thoroughly I almost forgot I was someone worth seeing. Around them, the gala continued, conversations flowing, champagne glasses clinking, the orchestra beginning a new song. But in their small corner of the ballroom, a marriage was ending, and both of them could feel the weight of that truth settling like debris after an explosion. What happens now? Daniel asked finally, his voice hollow. Claire looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a face she'd once known by heart. Now you go back to your table and finish your important presentation. You impress Harrison Chen and secure your Portland deal. You do exactly what you came here to do. And you? I start building something that actually matters, Claire said simply. With people who see my worth instead of people who require me to hide it. She turned away before he could respond, before the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes could fall, before the grief of ending a marriage could overwhelm the relief of finally claiming her freedom. The future was terrifying and uncertain, but for the first time in 3 years, it was hers. The powder room was empty when Claire pushed through the door, her heels clicking against marble that matched the ballroom's opulence but felt like a sanctuary away from the crowd's suffocating attention. She gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror. The woman looking back at her was familiar but somehow transformed, same brown eyes, same face, but something fundamental had shifted. She'd stopped shrinking. For the first time in years, she'd taken up the exact amount of space she deserved, and the feeling was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The door opened behind her. Claire tensed, preparing for another confrontation, but it was Melissa Chen who entered, Harrison's wife, the woman who'd smiled at her with polite dismissal when Daniel introduced her as staff. Ms. Whitmore, Melissa said, and her tone was entirely different now. I owe you an apology. Claire turned slowly, studying the other woman's face. Melissa's designer gown probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her jewelry spoke of generational wealth, but her expression held something Claire hadn't expected, genuine embarrassment. When your husband introduced you earlier, Melissa continued, fidgeting with her clutch, I just accepted it. I didn't question why a supposed event coordinator was wearing a wedding ring, why you and Daniel arrived together, why he seemed so tense when you were near him. I just accepted the narrative he presented because it was easier than paying attention. Why are you telling me this? Claire asked quietly. Melissa moved to the sink beside her, meeting Claire's eyes in the mirror. Because I'm ashamed. And because watching you up there, hearing you challenge every assumption this industry makes about who deserves to be heard, it made me realize how often I've been complicit in the dismissal of women who don't fit a certain mold. How many times have I smiled politely at someone's wife while secretly judging her for not being impressive enough? How many brilliant women have I overlooked because they weren't packaged in the right way? Claire felt something loosen in her chest. You're not responsible for Daniel's choices. No, Melissa agreed. But I'm responsible for mine. And I chose to be complicit in his lie because interrogating it would have been uncomfortable. She paused, then added, Harrison is furious, by the way. Not at you, at Daniel. He's questioning everything about your husband's judgment now. The fact that Daniel was hiding a visionary partner who secured a $5 billion initiative with his biggest client? Harrison sees that as either profound stupidity or profound insecurity, neither of which inspires confidence in business acumen. Claire absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Part of her felt vindicated, Daniel's attempt to hide her had backfired spectacularly. But another part, the part that still remembered loving him, felt a pang of sadness for the man who'd engineered his own downfall. What you said up there about finding the right partners instead of waiting for permission from the wrong ones, Melissa continued, that resonated with me. I've been hiding my own ambitions for years, playing the supportive corporate wife while my economics degree collects dust. Watching you claim your space made me realize how much of mine I've voluntarily surrendered. Before Claire could respond, the powder room door opened again and 3 more women entered, all from tonight's crowd, all suddenly eager to speak with the woman they'd ignored an hour ago. One of them, a striking black woman in emerald silk, stepped forward. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, she said, but I had to tell you, your presentation was exactly what this industry needs to hear. I run a minority-owned development firm, and we've been making the case for community-centered projects for years. Having Victoria Rothschild and a $5 billion initiative backing that vision is going to change everything. Others chimed in with similar sentiments. Claire found herself surrounded by women who'd been at this gala all along but whom she'd never noticed, perhaps because, like her, they'd learned to make themselves smaller in rooms dominated by men like Daniel and Harrison Chen. Now they formed a protective circle around her, sharing stories of their own professional battles, their own experiences of being dismissed or underestimated or told their compassion made them unqualified for serious business. We should form a network, someone suggested. Women in development who actually give a damn about the communities we're building in. Pool resources, share strategies, support each other's initiatives. I'm in, Melissa said immediately, surprising everyone including herself. The conversation flowed, ideas building on ideas, contact information exchanged with genuine enthusiasm rather than performative networking. Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of professional respect, of being taken seriously, of having her ideas met with excitement rather than dismissal. Eventually, they had to return to the ballroom. The program would continue, and Claire's absence would be noticed. But as she walked back through those doors with a half-dozen powerful women flanking her, she felt different. Stronger. Like she'd finally found her people after years of trying to fit into a space that was never meant for her. The ballroom had reorganized around her announcement. People kept approaching, venture capitalists interested in the initiative, architects wanting to collaborate, journalists requesting interviews. Claire handled it all with growing confidence, Victoria appearing periodically to run interference when someone got too aggressive or demanding. Across the room, Daniel stood with Harrison Chen and several other executives, but his posture had changed. He wasn't commanding the conversation anymore. He was defending himself, Claire realized, watching his hands gesture emphatically while Harrison's expression remained skeptically neutral. The golden boy who'd walked into this gala expecting triumph was now scrambling to explain why his wife had outmaneuvered him so completely. Claire should have felt vindicated. She should have enjoyed watching him squirm. But mostly she just felt tired, the exhausting weight of a marriage ending, of a future suddenly uncertain, of having to rebuild her entire life from pieces she'd let Daniel shatter. "You okay?" Victoria appeared at her elbow, her voice low and concerned. "Honestly? I don't know," Claire admitted. "This is what I wanted: recognition, opportunity, freedom from being invisible. But it's also the end of my marriage, and that's not nothing even when the marriage was broken." Victoria nodded understanding. Grief and relief can coexist. You can be proud of claiming your space and still mourn the loss of what you hoped your partnership would be. "He's staring at me," Claire said, sensing Daniel's gaze from across the room. "Let him look," Victoria said firmly. "Let him see exactly what he threw away while he was busy being ashamed of the most valuable thing he had. And let yourself feel whatever you feel: anger, sadness, liberation, all of it. You've earned the right to every emotion tonight brings." The orchestra began playing again, and couples moved toward the dance floor. Claire watched them with something like wistfulness, all those partnerships that seemed effortless, all those people who apparently didn't have to choose between love and respect, between marriage and dignity. She wondered how many of them were really happy or if they were all just better at pretending than she'd been. "Ms. Whitmore?" A young journalist approached nervously. "I'm writing a piece about the Community Development Initiative for the Tribune. Would you have time for a few questions?" Claire glanced at Victoria, who nodded encouragement. This was her future now: interviews and initiatives, professional recognition and public responsibility. It was everything she'd worked toward and nothing she'd planned for, all arriving in one explosive evening that had destroyed her marriage and rebuilt her identity in the same breath. "Of course," Claire said, straightening her shoulders and stepping into her new role with as much grace as she could muster, even as her heart broke quietly beneath her professional smile. 3 weeks later, Claire stood in her new apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, cardboard boxes stacked against walls that didn't hold any memories of Daniel, and let herself finally breathe. The divorce papers sat on her kitchen counter, already signed by both parties. Daniel hadn't fought her, hadn't fought for them, really. He'd been too busy managing the fallout at Meridian Industries, where Harrison Chen had quietly reassigned him to smaller projects and internal reviews rather than the high-profile deals that had defined his trajectory. The golden boy had lost his shine, and the industry had moved on with the casual cruelty it reserved for those who fell from grace. Claire's phone buzzed with another email, the 12th today, from developers, architects, community organizers, all wanting to be part of the Community Development Initiative. Victoria had been right, the announcement had shifted conversations across the entire industry. Articles in the Tribune and the Wall Street Journal had positioned Claire as a visionary challenging the status quo, and suddenly everyone wanted to align themselves with conscious development. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years, she'd tried to convince Daniel these ideas had value. For years, she'd diminished herself and her vision, trying to make him comfortable enough to listen. And all she'd needed was to stop asking permission and start acting on her own convictions. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Claire opened it to find Melissa Chen holding a bottle of wine and a genuine smile. "I come bearing gifts and no corporate husbands," Melissa announced, pushing past Claire into the sparsely furnished living room. "Harrison's at another industry dinner, which means I'm free to discuss forming our women's development network without him hovering and trying to offer unnecessary advice." Claire laughed, accepting the wine. "You're really serious about this?" "Completely," Melissa said, settling onto Claire's couch. "I've spent 15 years playing the decorative corporate wife while watching mediocre men get promoted over qualified women. Watching you claim your space at that gala was a wake-up call. I'm done shrinking myself to make insecure men comfortable. They poured wine and talked for hours, about the network they'd form, the projects they'd champion, the women they'd mentor. 6 others had already committed to monthly meetings, pooling resources and contacts to support female-led development projects. What had started as Claire's personal rebellion was becoming something larger, a movement challenging an industry that had long prioritized profit over people and power over partnership. "How are you, though?" Melissa asked eventually, her tone shifting to something gentler. "Really? Not the professional success version, the actual human being version." Claire considered the question seriously. "I'm sad," she admitted. "Even though the marriage was broken, even though leaving was necessary, I still grieve what I hoped we'd be. I grieve the man I thought I married and the future I imagined we'd build together." "That's allowed," Melissa said softly. "But I'm also free," Claire continued. "For the first time in years, I'm not monitoring every word I say or every action I take, worried about embarrassing someone who was embarrassed by my existence. I'm not making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's limited vision of who I should be. And that freedom, even with the grief, feels worth it." Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Victoria, texting about tomorrow's meeting with city planners for their first major project, a mixed-income development in Claire's old South Side neighborhood. The place she'd grown up, the community she'd never stopped caring about, would be the proving ground for everything she'd been fighting for. "I should go," Melissa said, standing and giving Claire an impulsive hug. "But I'm proud of you. What you did took courage most people don't have." After Melissa left, Claire stood at her window watching lights sparkle across the lake. She thought about Daniel, probably in their old penthouse, surrounded by luxury that felt increasingly hollow. She wondered if he missed her, if he'd figured out yet what he'd lost, if he ever lay awake regretting the choices that had led them here. But mostly she thought about the future, the projects she'd build, the communities she'd strengthen, the women she'd mentor who'd been told their compassion made them weak or their ideas were too idealistic. She thought about the little girl she'd been, growing up in a working-class neighborhood, dreaming of making a difference. That girl had never imagined ending up here, divorced from a billionaire and leading a $5 billion initiative, but she would have been proud of the woman Claire had become. Claire's phone rang, breaking her reverie. An unknown number, but she answered anyway. "Ms. Whitmore?" An unfamiliar male voice. "I'm calling from the mayor's office. Mayor Richardson would like to meet with you about potential partnerships between the city and your community development initiative." Claire smiled, already reaching for her calendar. This was her life now, important calls from important people who actually valued what she brought to the table. Not because someone's husband had vouched for her, not because she'd made herself small enough to be acceptable, but because she'd done the work and proven her worth. "I'd be happy to meet with the mayor," Claire said. "Let me give you my assistant's contact information to coordinate schedules." She had an assistant now. And an office. And a team of talented people who'd chosen to work with her because they believed in the mission. Everything had changed in 3 weeks, and yet somehow Claire felt more herself than she had in years. After the call ended, Claire poured another glass of wine and returned to the window. Somewhere in the city, in rooms like the one where she'd been dismissed and diminished, other women were probably shrinking themselves right now. Making themselves invisible to accommodate insecure partners, hiding their brilliance to avoid threatening fragile egos, convinced that love required sacrifice and dignity was negotiable. Claire hoped they'd find their moment of clarity like she had. She hoped they'd discover that the people who truly valued them wouldn't require invisibility as the price of partnership. She hoped they'd learn that being alone with dignity was infinitely better than being partnered with shame. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who'd survived betrayal and chosen herself, who'd walked away from wealth because freedom mattered more, who'd built something meaningful on the ashes of a marriage that had forgotten her humanity. She looked strong, Claire thought. She looked like someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to exist fully in her own life. And in 3 weeks, she'd be breaking ground on the South Side project. In 6 months, she'd have 3 more developments in progress. In a year, she'd have proven that conscious capitalism wasn't just possible but profitable, that caring about communities didn't make you weak but made you wise. Daniel's world had been built on appearances, on careful image management, on the exhausting performance of being impressive enough for rooms that would never fully accept him. Claire's world would be built on substance, on genuine relationships, on the quiet confidence of someone who'd stopped trying to fit inside spaces that were never designed for her. She didn't know if Daniel would ever understand what he'd lost. She didn't know if he'd recognize, someday when the industry was praising her work and her name carried more weight than his, that the woman he'd called the help had been the most valuable thing he'd ever had. But it didn't matter anymore. His recognition wasn't required for her success. His approval wasn't necessary for her worth. His shame had taught her something invaluable, that she could survive being diminished and choose to rebuild herself stronger, that love wasn't supposed to cost your dignity, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was walk away from people who couldn't see your value. Claire raised her wine glass to her reflection, to the woman she'd become, to the future she'd claimed for herself. The night sparkled with possibility, and for the first time in years, she knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. And that knowledge was worth more than any marriage that required her to forget it.